green to North Carolina's pines. They walked those miles with hope still in their minds. With every step, the pain was hard to bear. Yet through the tears, they chose to persevere. In Tennessee, they felt the river's cold embrace. Their spirit strong, no hardship could erase. The land of ancestors fading in their view, but their hearts held firm, love for what they knew. On the trail of tears where sorrow met the land, they carried dreams within a calloused hand. In Oklahoma, they found strength in pain, survived the journey through the snow and rain.
Of the Trail of Tears to commemorate, to understand, and to promote understanding of this tragic event in our history. And you know, the Park Service, we have like all these wonderful resources that the Park Service has developed as part of that, including this map that we all know and love here. And if we zoom in on that, you know, one of the highlighted areas is there at Fort Cass, you know, the area that we visited yesterday. And of course, there at the Hiwassee River Heritage Center, you saw interpretation of that because it sits right in the middle of the whole Fort Cass Historic District there. Well, you also heard Melissa Woody, and you understood after you heard that Melissa Woody can sweet talk anybody into anything. And I had done a presentation at one of our conferences a while back about our work at Fort Armistead. And Melissa said, "Brad, we want you to come over to Fort Cass and do that over there." And I was like, yes, okay, all right. But then following that, Steve Burns and his team from NPS were over and they did a charrette, and Steve was all over the place, and he said, there is so much potential here for interpreting this place and understanding this place. And he really got Mike Romero, who's an archaeologist at NPS, on fire about this. And Mike said, "Brett, we've got some money. We want you to bring in a geophysicist." That's somebody, that's a fancy name for people who use tools to see what's underground without digging them up, right? To bring in Chet Walker, and you can sort of manage this survey and try to see what kind of extant archaeological resources are surviving there at Fort Cass. And so I said, okay, you know, if you've got money to pay Chet, we can do this. And we signed on to this survey to really sort of start understanding. This is a project that we talked about many, many years ago. Russ Townsend was going to undertake this project. And he talked about it at our meeting at Wagner in 2000, I think. But we never quite put it together and pulled it off. But this gave us an opportunity to get out on the ground. And I'll have to say that Melissa, and particularly Darlene Goins, had done all this previous groundwork and really sort of paved the way with local landowners to allow us to do this study. And it would have been impossible without them and impossible before that. So we all know this map from Erasmus Darwin Keyes, you know, that shows this kind of schematic of all the forts that were established and the routes between the forts for the Trail of Tears. And among those, I'll simplify this a little bit, are a series of sort of headquarter stations that were called immigration depots. And we visited a couple of those this time. So we were down at Ross's Landing the other night, and we were at Fort Cass yesterday. These were the places that the military had set up to bring Cherokee prisoners together to transship them by water to the west. Later, when it became obvious that that wasn't going to happen, they shifted from Gunner's Landing over to Fort Payne. But these are the immigration depots. These are ground zero. And Fort Cass sat at the Cherokee Agency. And so it was more ground zero than any others, I would have to say. That agency had been there for quite a while. The agency had been there since 1820. This is a map from 1832 showing Calhoun and the agency there. And it was established by Return J. Meigs. After the Treaty of 1819, they had to shift the location of the federal agency to the Cherokees, and they chose this place directly across from Major John Walker's and that big ferry over the Hiwassee River. And this was a primary entry point for Cherokee Nation, for people coming from the north. They check in at the agency. It was the place where you did business. If you were in Cherokee Nation, that's where you did business with the federal government. So there's all kinds of stuff that go on there at the agency. And the agency existed there from 1820 up until the ratification of the New Echota Treaty, and the agency at that point ended, and it just became the center for immigration. It became the depot there. So Meigs was there, Joe McMinn was there, and he was buried up on the hill over beside where we were last night. He was not nearly as nice a guy as he looks like in this picture. Foisted some really awful treaties on the Cherokee people. And then, with the passage of the Indian Removal Act, we see the sort of the mission at the agency shifting. Hugh Montgomery is the agent there, but they also brought in B.F. Curry as the superintendent of immigration. And he was rightfully the most hated man in the Cherokee Nation. He was, as people wrote, that vile Curry. And he's probably also buried up there in that cemetery after having died of what we think was an attack of cirrhosis there, and was replaced by Nathaniel Smith in 1837. So they're established there until, again in 1837, this becomes the headquarters for removal operations. And I'll back up just 1 minute. The reason Fort Cass is there is because Curry thought that after Jack Walker Jr. got killed, assassinated, that he was next. Because he was pretty paranoid, rightfully so. And so he pulled the Army companies from Fort Armistead over to guard him, and they established Camp Cass, which became Fort Cass. Part of his cover operation. General Wool established there, and during Wool's period there, it becomes Fort Cass because they established fortifications in the location we looked at yesterday. And then when Wool was withdrawn from the Cherokee Nation and the actual action of the forced removal, the forced deportation became obvious, the agency area in Fort Cass becomes the headquarters of Major General Winfield Scott, Major General, he's the highest ranking officer in the U.S. Army. They bring him there, and he has an office there. He also likes to spend his time up in Athens, where there's lots of good food and drink. So mostly he's going back and forth between Athens and this place during the time. So that's just a little backstory. There is an amazing document, and I'm going to center everything else around this one document. And it's a map that was made of the Fort Cass Emigrating Depot on July 11th, 1838. The reason that map was made is because Winfield Scott had agreed to delay the Cherokee immigration at the request of George Loudon and a group of chiefs who petitioned to delay this immigration that was going on very rapidly. All these Cherokees from Georgia had been just shipped off in this chaotic scene, and they were afraid that these folks would actually get to, as they called it, the Arkansas too fast. That they would land in midsummer, and there was already cholera afoot in Knoxville. This was a really incredibly hot, drought-ridden summer, and that gave rise to cholera. Cholera had wiped out a Cherokee immigration party in 1834 and everyone was terrified of it. It was a new disease. It was called the Asiatic cholera. And so they thought, if you drop everybody at Fort Smith in midsummer, we're going to die in droves there. And so they petitioned to delay that immigration. Scott granted that, but that meant that the tens of thousands of people who were gathered into these depots now had no place to go. They weren't going to go. He was actually going to parole them because the Cherokee leadership, the nationalists, had signed a pledge now that you have us captured, we agree that we are going west, we don't like it, but we're going to do it, and Cherokee people were as good as their word. So he was going to parole people and let them go back home and spend the summer. Georgia, you heard me kind of bashing on Georgia from the bus the other day. Georgia declared that they would hang any Cherokee caught within the chartered limits of Georgia. So Scott couldn't release them. He said, well, you've got to stay right here. They had no preparations at all to be able to sort of feed and shelter and give aid to the people who were now in their custody there around Fort Cass and these other immigration depots. They had to scurry kind of into this emergency relief operation to set things up to provide for people to spend that summer there around Fort Cass and these other depots and other camps that they established through that summer before commencing immigration in the fall. And ultimately, as we all know, that immigration was the conduct of that and the management of that was signed over to the Cherokee Nation. That happened a little bit later than this. But Scott needed intelligence. He needed to know where people were, if they were going to supply people with rations and shelter, medical assistance, etc. He had to know where people were, and they just immediately started scattering camps out across this area that became known as the Depot Reserve. And this is a map. I wish it were 3 times this size so you could see everything on it. This is a map that was created by this guy, Henry Prince, who was one of the founders of the U.S. Army Corps of Topographical Engineers. And he was sent out to map Fort Cass and show where people were. And he rode around the depot and very quickly made this amazing map of the depot that shows all these roads, and it shows the topography, and it shows where people are camped, and it shows buildings, and it shows fields, it shows all kinds of stuff. And Steve Burns was like, yeah, this is the bomb here. We've got it now. And all we have to do is rubber sheet it and fit it to GIS, and we're right on everything. It wasn't quite that easy. You can't rubber sheet it. What he did is he mapped specific locations in amazing detail, and they kind of sketched in everything in between, right? It worked great for what they needed to do, which was be able to find people, to provide rations, to get particularly doctors into these camps. But that was issued, I think in the interest of size, it was July 11th that came out. So taking that map, we're able to look at this area, and we did in fact consign all of this information to GIS to manage this. So we were looking at this area. That's the Hiawassee River, that blue line through there. And you drove through here in buses, and we kind of backed up in places and did some of that. And that's the area of the agency reserve. It's about 12 miles by about 8 miles. There were thousands of people camping there through that god-awful summer of 1838. And by taking that map, we're able then... Siri is talking to me through my hearing aids. And she just told me she's listening, and I'm always nervous about that. That she's listening, and then I can just hear Siri go, BS. But by using that map and then by understanding the principles upon which that Prince operated under in creating this map that's locally very accurate, globally not so much. But by then identifying those local locations, those particular locations that are well mapped, we're able to reconstruct, do an entire landscape reconstruction of that Fort Cass district there, and to place all these resources out there so they can be interpreted, protected. A lot of this is private land, and this is a hot development zone. Okay, so a lot of these are, if they're not imminently threatened, they soon will be. Okay, you have to know where things are first. So we were able to do this, and in putting that together, what we saw is there's actually multiple landscapes that we need to talk about. So there were the Cherokee civilian occupations that were already there near the agency before any of this was going down. There are fields, there are houses, there are homes. This is part of the Cherokee homeland, and there's a Cherokee landscape that's out there. There are the deportee occupations. There are the encampments that people spent those months of 1838 in, and that's why this map was created. But there's also the military establishments that were there. The forts, the cantonments, the encampments of U.S. military. There's the Cherokee Agency, which has existed and grown since 1820. And there's also Anglo-Americans out there. There are white people who have moved in. And so there's those civilian occupations, and there's the domestic occupations and commercial occupations that are out there. And then there's the infrastructure. There are roads, bridges, mills, etc., that are there on that landscape. So if we look, for instance, at the Cherokee civilian occupations, and thank you, Debbie Moore, for transcribing all those property valuations that helped us tremendously. So there are all these improvements that are within that agency or that depot reserve, including those of Betsy Walker, for all the Betsy Walker descendants out there, and Lewis Ross. And you saw Lewis Ross's, or the location of Lewis Ross's houses yesterday. We're able to use those maps and actually identify a number of those locations just by collateral information that we're able to pick up from property valuations and claims papers, etc. So like the properties of Blackbird and Lewis Ross and Tobacco John and Betsy Walker. Tobacco John lived up there in Mouse Creek, and we drove right past where his house was. We drove right through his fields yesterday as we went there. And what he said in his testimony, he said that he lived about a mile from the agency, right on that, what's now Walker Valley Road, and the soldiers were close by, and they ate up all his chickens. They ate up all his chickens. Nothing's safe around those soldiers. And got his corn too. The Cherokee folks who were in camp there is like, okay, just a field of corn, let's eat it. Because people had to have something to eat, and salt pork wasn't going to cut it. Blackbird, who was, I think, his father-in-law, lived right up on the river. And again, he lost all his corn to the troops and to other Cherokee prisoners. And he was forced to go into camps. Even though he lived right there, they made him leave his house, go into these camps. We're able to identify what house is Blackbird's by the fact that here's a U.S. Army Corps map from the 1890s, and it shows Blackbird Shoals. And Blackbird Shoals are right there. That's Blackbird's house in that relative spot. But we thought that was pretty cool. And then, of course, Lewis Ross, who had one of the most amazing houses in the Cherokee Nation, is valued at $3,000. And we know his house location because it shows up on the Senex map of Charleston, 1839 map, and it has survived in some form up until the present. Here's a photograph of the Barrett Hotel. Barrett took over that property in the 1840s. That's Lewis Ross's house in that photograph. That's what it looked like. And it matches up pretty well with the description of the property valuation. And of course, that's what it looks like now. I was so relieved to see it all whitewashed. It was purple and pink at one time there. And then that area of the agency, which was close to, on the other side of the river from other side of Agency Creek from Lewis Ross's. And here's an account that Jack made me privy to and supplied to me from Wiley Lowry, who keeps a journal while he's riding through the midst of the Cherokee removal. You know, he's a peddler. And he comes through, and he comes right down, right through where we ate our dinner last night, crossed the river on the ferry, had to pay 25 cents, and got into the agency, what he called the agency, and he's describing stuff all over the place there. It was a bustling town there around the agency. He said they're all log houses, log cabins, but there's stores. There's 17 stores there. That's everyone who has descended upon that place to sell their goods to the Cherokees who were being held captive there and have money that's come in from their claims in payment. And these guys are there to capture all of that money because there's no cash money out there. If you remember, this is after the great financial collapse of 1837. Cherokees are the only people who actually have cash, and everybody goes to get it. That agency area, come on, there we go. We reconstruct it as being sort of up there along Highway 11 and sort of then stretching along this parallel street there, that whole complex. And we went out there, we had access to this one vacant lot because most of the stuff is people's backyards. And while people are really happy for you, some people are really happy for you to go around with this equipment there, other people not so much, and their yards are full of junk. They're full of all kinds of stuff which make it really hard to do geophysics. But we had this vacant lot there, and we ready for the next thing that was going to happen. And there's actually part of an old road bed through that lot. So we're like, bingo, we've got this thing. Chet gets out there with his gradiometer. He puts on like acid rock in his ears, and he just goes like a machine all day, gathering data. He gathered both gradiometer data and ground penetrating radar data. Here's the plot of what we got. Nothing jumped out at us. There's a lot of junk out there. There are metal pipes, there's lots of nails, there's all kinds of construction debris, but there wasn't something that said, this is the agency. And so we're moving fast, right? We're moving fast, trying not to break things, but we're moving fast through there. We wanted to see about Fort Cass. And what Prince showed about Fort Cass, that location that we pointed up to, with a key, there's a physical element there that tells us exactly where Fort Cass is. And that is a giant sinkhole that was cut in half by a meander of the Hiwassee River. And so he shows that big dip in his sign. Well, that big dip's right there. That's a LiDAR image of that. That big dip, that sinkhole's right there. That's where Fort Cass sat. In the middle of this neighborhood. Again, a difficult place to operate, but we went out and we're in people's driveways. And Chet's got his GPR rig there, but he found something. We don't know if it's like somebody's ancient septic tank or not, but there is a very large rectangular anomaly there. That is a big, deep hole in the ground that's been filled in and covered over. And we're like, powder magazine? Because we know there was a powder magazine there. In the fort, there's a whole magazine building. We don't know for sure. They wouldn't let us rip out their driveway. But I think that we could say there are still extant remains, extant soils, where there might be evidence of the fort surviving there. Fort Foster, Camp Worth, that was down at Rattlesnake Springs. And we knew, that's pretty well out in the open. We went and talked with Mr. John Moore about access to that place. And then went out and walked around. And there is an amazing remnant of the Newtown Road there. We pointed to it from our bus, and the guys on the other bus didn't see me point, I don't think. There was a tree line up there. That's the Newtown Road. It's very prominent on the Prince map. And this triangular configuration is right here in the LiDAR. 2015 LiDAR, you can see that same road configuration out there. So we're like, X marks the spot. This is the place. Now, Fort Foster was a little small facility, probably very much like this fort in Florida that, by the way, Henry Prince also drew. We got up in that spot and we did gradiometry and ground penetrating radar. And again, I'm sorry, these things look like sonograms, right? You have to believe me if I tell you what you're seeing. That's really, so we covered quite an area out there for both Fort Foster and Camp Worth. And there around Fort Foster, there's all kinds of stuff. You know, these big bright things are like pieces of barbed wire in the ground. But there's one really big anomaly out there. It's a big magnetic anomaly that's right in here, big square thing. And we talked with Mr. Moore, and we said, was there ever anything up there? And he said, oh yeah, there was a log barn up there when I was a boy. Now, he's in his 80s. He's the 5th generation Moore on that land. And he said, my granddaddy tore that barn down, and when he tore it down, there was a big cellar under it. And I said, have you ever seen a cellar under a barn before? And he said, the only one I ever saw. That was the last blockhouse of Fort Foster. That's the powder magazine that's under there. That's what's showing up in that gradiometry. We shifted over to Camp Worth. We thought, oh yeah, we got a big military encampment, which is really a bunch of guys hanging out in tents. There's not much you're going to see in geophysics other than the stuff they dropped. And we covered that area, and there's a bunch of stuff out there. But it's all on the upper edge, and it's all in a line, and it's all a broken up hog wire fence up there. So it'd take forever to sort that out. But we were able to say that surface is relatively intact, and more intensive survey in the future might well be able to actually identify what's there. I'm going to shift over now, looking at my run time, and talk about the deportee occupations, because that was really our focus. And these are ephemeral occupations. They're not the kind of thing you can find with geophysics. We weren't really quite using the right tools. We did have, after a consultation with various tribal historic preservation offices, Eastern Band, Cherokee Nation, UKB there, we had permission to apply metal detection because we knew there would be metal on these locations. And so we employed that. And there's a whole series of these encampments all over the place out there. You can see this list here. And we sort of picked and chose among those. Some of these have houses on top of them. And we went for the low-hanging fruit, particularly the places that we could get access to, where landowners allowed us out there. One place, which we didn't have access to, it was owned by the paper company at the time, was the location, the location of the Cherokee Cantonment. I had ignored that for years. There's 2 little lines out there and stuck in the woods. Well, it turned out when you look at the key, it says Cherokee Cantonment. And that is Deportation Central. If there's any resource out there that's more focused on the deportation, it's this cantonment. It was constructed in 1832. There's a whole series of barracks buildings there. There's a blockhouse there. There was a commissary. There was a house for Temple and Ross there. And it was used from 1832 through 1838. This is where Ross was. This is where, it turns out, the steamboat landing on the Hiwassee was there, not up at Charleston. This is the steamboat landing. This is where people departed by water. And so it was just like putting that together, although we sneaked out there, okay? I had to pee. And the reason I'm not showing you like precise maps is like somebody had been using this map for a treasure map. And we got out there and somebody had gone out with a metal detector and rooted all around this place. We do not want this destroyed. This is the place. And so here's a kind of a description of that. Yeah, we found little holes all over the place where people are looking for John Ross's buttons and buckles and things like that. So this is a spot that we want to look at in the future once we can secure it and protect it. Down on Mouse Creek, that area that we went through yesterday on Walker Valley Road, I mean, this is a description. This is Dr. Jordan talking about the camps there. And along that stretch, he said there were 1,600 folks from North Carolina in there. Of course, that's what I work on. I'm like, I want to see that. But this was a place where most of our accounts really are talking about the sickness that's prevalent in the camps, the whooping cough and the dysentery and those sorts of things. We started to work out there on a farm, and the folks were like, yeah, but you can't dig any holes because we're cutting hay here, you know. So we're like, well, okay, we're not going to find anything with our equipment. And so we did move on, but not until we actually identified some stuff on the ground that allowed us to key that in. And so those encampments, there's the middle encampment and the southern encampment there that show up on Prince's maps. And when you get in around those locations, you can see that Prince was standing on the ground when he drew those things. There's stuff you can't see on other maps. You can't see it if you're from the road. You have to be on the ground, get on a hill, and sketch the thing out. And that's exactly what he's depicting there. But then we have people describing these camps so that one is at Mr. Spriggs's and one is at Mrs. Walker's. And so that correspondence of those camps with houses that are shown tell us that, oh, that's Spriggs's house up there. That's Mrs. Walker's house down there. We're able to confirm Mrs. Walker's house location in some other property records, land records. But what I kind of waved my hands at as we passed is the Spriggs Cemetery is sitting there, which was out close to their house. That cemetery is still there along Walker Valley Road. So, you know, a key about these things. We went from there, we got up to the Cherokee encampments there on this farm, and we were able to get right in on the correct location. There's a spring that's shown on Prince's map, and there's the spring right there. These springs were very, very, very important during that incarceration period because there was the groundwater level was dropping, surface water was hard to come by, and people were really focused on these big springs that weren't going dry. So this is the perfect location for encampment. We went up on that hill, we threw everything we had at it, and came up with a beautiful gradiometry map. Went out and metal detected, and it's all early 20th century junk. All of it. All of it. There was nothing left. And the reason was it was farmed in cotton until the 30s, and all the soil that had been up there had moved to the bottom of the hill. What would remain of that evidence of that camp is buried there at the bottom of the hill. So I'm telling you, every place we didn't find things, right? But we weren't skunked completely. We went down on the Hiwassee River and got permission to look at a place near the mouth of Cherokee Creek. And you can see there's this road that shows up on Prince's map, and there's all these camps along the road. We went out and began work. There's Chet in the remote distance there with the ground penetrating radar. This is a daunting task. Usually ground penetrating radar, you might cover an area this size in a day. But we were like going at high speed, and you know, there's Chet with his acid rock. Just, I could hear it. And he had headphones on. And just blazing over the scene. We covered, let's see, it was in hectares. We covered about 22 acres out there with geophysics. And we found something pretty interesting. So here's the gradiometry plot, and again, I know it didn't look like anything. There's a close-up of it, and you can see there's this kind of fuzzy thing right through the middle. That's a magnetic anomaly. That's what we like to call them. Right through the middle of that field. When I went along with the metal detector, it's like, oh, there's a Civil War mini ball. There's a horseshoe. There's all the stuff that people dropped along a road. What Chet found then is that's the road to McNair's. Those camps are down there, not up at the edge of the current road, as we originally thought. And we identified 3 of the camps that were there along that roadway. There's one of them. There's the Locust 2 encampment site. There's another encampment site at the foot of that hill, right where Chet is. And there's the location of the road to McNair's, to the McNair's boatyard, down on the Conasauga. There was a big area of outwash there where you couldn't see the road, but you could see all kinds of magnetic anomalies. And then trash that people had dumped in the road, lots of metal trash. Somebody had wadded up a fence wire and stuck in the old roadbed. When they filled it in, there's the radar for that area, and you can still see the road on that. So it's a buried road trace. And then when I started working through there with the metal detector, because now we needed to confirm first that the camps were there, and what did a camp look like anyway? Because as far as I knew, no one had ever located one. We didn't know what was there. We didn't know what to expect. We had ideas. I mean, the shelters were just like, they stuck 4 posts in the ground and put bark roofs over the tops of them. You're not going to see that. You would have to destroy the site, excavating, in order to see that sort of thing. We're not going to see that. But we wanted to see artifacts, make sure that it dated to the right period, and sure enough, when we started looking around, there's clusters of artifacts from the 1830s in every one of these locations. That's a pair of scissors there. We found 2 pairs of scissors. These are cheap little shears, like embroidery scissors, that are sold at those shops up at the agency. These are some of the goods that peddlers are pawning off on Cherokee prisoners. There's a piece of a trigger guard of a rifle, and that's a brass kettle fragment that's there. There's a busted up Dutch oven out there. A brass hasp from some kind of bag, maybe saddlebags, we're not sure, and a flattened lead ball. It's a rifle ball hammered out flat. I had seen these on other, those rifle balls like that on other Cherokee sites from the time of the removal. Not exactly sure what they are, but they show up very consistently as these discs. So I thought, okay, that's a pretty good indication that we're looking at stuff from that period. So we got out there finally after all of that and found some artifactual evidence to show that in fact you can locate these camps. We can identify what they look like. This, by the way, was all catch and release. And that's that. So we found these things. We took pains not to intrude any deposits that weren't already disturbed by plowing. We found them. I'm on my knees with a toothbrush and water in the field, and clean them up, put them on a black background, photograph them, and then they go back, mapped in place. But we'd done it. We'd found out what these places looked like, these last residences, temporary residences of Cherokee folks in the East. And I got home that night. This is in January. It's about 15 degrees. We're out there doing this. I got home that night. It was 3 hours home. And I told my wife, who has put up with me for a very long time, and all this crazy stuff I'm out doing. And we'd actually been doing this stuff for months. And I said, we found it. We finally found it. We found artifacts that these people had dropped. And she said, well, how'd that make you feel? And all of a sudden, my archaeological brain just went away. And I said, incredibly sad. Because I spent my career following these people. Even though they're, dead for 150 years, gone, I felt like I knew them. I read their words, I followed their paths, I found their homes. And here's the last place in the old homeland. And they dropped this stuff, and I'm the first person to see it since they dropped it. And I felt like I had to say goodbye to them at that point. Now, if it has that kind of impact on a crusty old archaeologist, think of what this means. This is what this really means to the people who are directly connected to this. To many of you out there, this was, these few little things there, that was the archaeological apogee of everything I'd ever done. To see this, to follow these people to this point, and then to say goodbye to them. So I'd like to, I'm going to end on that, and you can get out your tissues and do that. I'll get out mine. But I'd like to thank many, many people. I'm just going to thank a few here. The TIPO offices, Eastern Band TIPO, Cherokee Nation TIPO, UKB TIPO, who all facilitated this work, and we were able to talk our way all the way through how to conduct this in this one of the most sensitive Cherokee sites there might be, or districts. I'd like to thank the National Park Service, especially Mike Taylor, and then the Heritage Center, and especially Darlene Goins and Melissa Woody, who said Brad, and Lars Mann, who helped us out. And then my field school I took out there, showing how to operate this equipment. And then Chet Walker and Andy Denson, my colleagues at, Andy is my colleague at Western Carolina. And I also like to thank this guy, Henry Prince. Because he was obviously concerned. He was sent out to do something to attend to the welfare of these people that they had captured and that they were going to deport. And he did it with great care, and he did it with great accuracy. He lived out quite a life. He ended up as a brigadier general. He was a decorated hero in the American Civil War, and ended his own life in London many years later, no doubt remembering everything he had done in the Seminole War and the Cherokee removal and all the wars that he'd been in. But I think just for this project, I owe him at least a little bit of acknowledgement for having created that map. I want to thank you guys for sitting here while lunch is getting lined up, and it's 12:03 and I'm late already.